So welcome, everybody. It's good to have the second session in the morning. I have one more talk a little bit later at 4. I think by then everybody's either asleep or has already left. So I'm not hopeful for that one, but hopefully this one will be a good session for you guys as well. So I'm Jim Nasr, and I work at a company called Art Media. We're based out of Atlanta. We do quite a lot of work with enterprise content management, basically. Not as much in Drupal per se, we do quite a bit of Drupal as well, but really more around integrating Drupal with other tools such as Phonegap or Alfresco or things like that. We do a lot of work with the federal government as well, and come across different solutions. So this session really specifically is about integrating Phonegap with Drupal. And the good news here is that the Drupal part of it is actually pretty easy. So there's more focus here on Phonegap. And we'll see how it goes, and I'll talk about a couple of case studies. Here's my contact information if you'd like to reach out. If you have bad things to say, all that is wrong. Find somebody else. Just joking aside. So real quick, in brief, this is kind of like my one slide to, if you're going to pay attention to anything, pay attention to this, and then we'll kind of hopefully elaborate on it. So the mobile landscape is really kind of all over the place. There are lots of providers. There's cloud providers. There's people like Phonegap who provide mobile development environments. There's obviously Apple and Google with their iOS and Android platforms, and lesser extent BlackBerry and Windows, and some other folks, kind of more peripheral people in the mix. But there's also a whole bunch of infrastructure mobile providers, and there's various kind of specs and languages. It's really kind of convoluted. I'll have a picture to show you that, but it's important to know that because there's definitely a kind of a bigger picture you have to understand when you think mobile, and certainly gets into how you go about it too. And then there's also kind of a real blurred line between what is web content that you make available through a mobile device and what is native content or native applications. And there's definitely a kind of some do's and don'ts on that. We'll kind of get into that. So Phonegap specifically, which we'll focus on quite a bit. It's really a from the user perspective, it's really just a browser. It's like Chrome without the Chrome file menu and things like that. It's a 100x width and height maxed out browser. And then it's also a development environment where you can write primarily in HTML5 and CSS and JavaScript. Right, you develop on that, and then it's got APIs and compilers that help you basically deploy to different mobile operating systems. Certainly iOS and Android, but also BlackBerry and Windows, and 2 or 3 other ones that are less used. Phonegap, and again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. There isn't a whole lot you got to do with Drupal to make Phonegap go. It's really mainly about configuring certain things correctly and having some site building skills, which is good. With Drupal 8, you may have even more features that make it easier to use. Most of my talk and the work we've done is around Drupal 7. But I know with Drupal 8, that there's a heavy focus on being kind of responsive design, mobile ready to begin with. I was looking at the Spark, the authoring kind of distribution. There's a lot of mobile built into that. So there may be some overlaps between what you may or may not want to do in a tool like Phonegap. So one of the kind of key things we're going to kind of walk through, I guess, as an example, is a project we did for a client of ours called the Well Project. They're an HIV advocacy organization, global, have well over 10 million hits per year, and a very kind of vital and kind of needed tool for a number of women, is focused for women with HIV around the world. So it was an important project in the context of what they wanted to do, and it was important from our perspective because it was really kind of a mobile first strategy executing for this client. And then what I'm going to kind of get into a little bit at the end, I guess, is basically best practices for doing mobile, doing Phonegap, Drupal, Phonegap. Hopefully that'll be useful. Some of these things you kind of come across the hard way, and we certainly did. So hopefully, if I can give you advice to avoid some of those traps, then that's a good thing. So moving on. Real quick, here's the kind of the landscape, and it's not. Whoa, that's a little too fast. It's not by any means all of it. It's just a sampling, and really this is just mainly development tools and development environments, right? We're not really even talking about infrastructure and other things. And so you can see it's already kind of a mess, right? There's Phonegap right there. We're focusing on here, and then it kind of certainly taps into this area of JTouch, jQuery as well, and Sencha, which we'll talk about in a little bit. They're all kind of JavaScript frameworks that you can augment Phonegap with. But there's other products that are kind of, like for instance, Accelerator is another hybrid development environment, but it's different to Phonegap in that you're really, instead of writing HTML and CSS and an open kind of API, you're basically writing you're writing to their API, and then they in turn are interpreting the code for the mobile environments. So a little bit different. Same thing with Corona here. This is like a C++ development environment. So and there's definitely some pros and cons which we'll kind of get into. But it's interesting. Adobe's in the mix here. Most of you guys may probably know that Phonegap was an open source initiative to Apache called Cordova, and Adobe's taken it over and still remains open source. So moving on. But basically, there are really kind of three development approaches for mobile development. Real quick, I think all of this is quite by now you probably already know about it. It's native, which is you're writing if you're talking iOS, for instance, you're writing Xcode. You have Xcode, you're writing Objective-C, right? That's your development environment. Web apps, essentially is HTML5. It's just HTML, and most of it is I would say is trivial kind of web content that's surfaced in a responsive manner, onto a mobile device. And then there's a hybrid, which is by definition somewhere in between, and and to more or less kind of meets that definition depending on your context, and we'll kind of talk about that. So what's the best approach? I think that's a question that people always say, hey, what should we do? And of course it's never that easy. I think there's a couple of key questions you have to first pose to yourself and then try and answer. One is, what is the specific purpose of the app, right? And if you don't know it, a lot of people, like we've had some clients come to us and say, hey, we like the work that you did for our website. We want to take our website and put it in a mobile device. And we're like, okay, why? But that makes no sense, because you're not going to, the user experience isn't what the user will want to have. You have to pick and choose what it is on your website that you want to surface. And it doesn't even make sense, right? Why would you spend X amount of money and time to do something and then you have to maintain it if the purpose really isn't going to be served? And the second question is, what are the realistic deployment platforms? And what are the kind of the considerations that go with that, right? Such as your budget, right? It's great if you could deploy, to 4 different platforms, iOS, Android, BlackBerry, and Windows. But you could potentially be managing, and you are going to be managing 4 different mobile environments, possibly more than one source code, right? And all the usability and nuances that kind of go with that. If you have the budget for that, doesn't make sense. If you have the users to justify that. So those are really good questions. I think you should ask those things, because you can easily waste a whole lot of money on on useless consultants like us. And then later, like 6 months later, you're like, well, what's going on here? Well, I'm spending $200,000 a month. I'm maintaining all these mobile things. I'm getting 75 hits per day. Crazy things. And there's no ROI. So you gotta think about that. So here's my thoughts. It's not gospel, but I think it's probably sensible based on what I've come across. If you want to do things that are native rich, and native rich isn't just like using the gyroscope or whatever, but native rich as in the user experience that the user expects, is what they would absolutely want to see from a native Apple app or something like that, or like a Flipboard, something like that. Then then you got to go native. If performance is really important, you got to go native. is really kind of, I would say, is the end kind of categorical recommendation. If you're doing simple kind of cross-platform apps, and it's really important to kind of focus on the simple part of it, because you could do cross-platform apps that are not simple, that require a good amount of kind of user interaction, particularly user interaction, feedback back and forth, or that are kind of the usability is complex, or games, something like that. That's not a good choice for hybrid, right? And certainly not Phonegap, because HTML5 has significant limitations that you're going to come across, from usability, from a performance, frankly from knowing it well enough so you don't stumble into the pitfalls such as content reflow. Because you could have all kinds of issues with content reflow in HTML5 if you don't know exactly what you're doing. So keep it, if it's simple enough, then you're going to be okay, and a hybrid probably is going to be a good bet for you, because you'll probably code once, maybe configure 2 or 3 times, maybe compile 2 or 3 times, test exactly the number of times that you have your environment, but it's a decent choice. So again, simple transactional apps, yeah, same kind of idea there, right? If you're doing major, kind of like banking and things like that, you don't really want to be thinking hybrid. Native is probably still your best bet. I'm not even really talking about security concerns here, just mainly from development and usability. If you're going to go hybrid, if you're going to go and have offline features like cache content, things like that, realistically, you can either can only go hybrid or native, right? So you got to keep that in mind. Simple content, very simple, really simple content. Just go with a content app. I think these days you see this less and less, to be honest with you. Just because most of us as users of these expensive devices have bigger demands. We're like, I don't want to look at some really kind of like something that doesn't really engage me, right? So if it doesn't engage you, it's too simple. Maybe not really good choice to create an app. And then finally, and this is one that I know Drupal 8, is all over. I know you guys probably. Who here is doing responsive design? All right, great. So I mean, this is obviously bread and butter for a lot of people in this room. So this is a really good choice for many of us, right? Many times, and especially if you look at Drupal 8, how responsive design is built into the core, right? This could be a great choice for lots of you guys, right? So that may save quite a bit of time, because and again, responsive design is not a silver bullet either. There's definitely some things you're going to have to tweak. Particularly if you think, right, you want something that looks good on iPhone, and let's just focus on iOS. iPhone, iPad, and iPad mini. Just those 3 different things you have to worry about, right? Just from size, from kind of pixel density, things like that. But certainly if you go across Android, right, with infinite number of devices, it's tricky. But it's probably, if you're going to do this, and you know what you're doing, you're going to save money certainly overdoing native and possibly over hybrid. So just a little pictorial of kind of what some of the tools look like, and I'll focus on Phonegap here. This is from, I think from November of 2012, so it's a little bit aged. But you can see, there was about 600,000 SDK downloads at that time, and I think now it's probably over 1 million. So it's growing fast, and I think if you look at the numbers, if you just purely look at the numbers, this is the one that's growing the fastest, and some of these have been around longest. And this is actually a kind of a survey, more of a empirical user survey done by this organization called InfoQ, that kind of basically backs up that comment, that if you look here, most of these guys, the developers and companies that they had voted, they're saying that they're adopting Phonegap, which makes a lot of sense because Phonegap is free, right? Is open source, and you're using HTML5 and CSS and JavaScript, which is a good entry point for most people. Yes.
You haven't talked about jQuery mobile. So how does that fit into this space?
Yeah, so it fits into it a little bit. I mean, you can use jQuery mobile in alongside Phonegap, or in of itself, or alongside Sencha Touch, for instance. So it's another set of, it's really a library that you can use. It provides a certain kind of functionality that you can just put into Phonegap. I'll tell you actually the Vault project use case that I'll talk about in a little bit, kind of comments on that a little bit. At the end of the day, you have to kind of decide what library meets the needs that you have. It's a decent tool. The new jQuery 2.0, jQuery Mobile 2.0 is a really interesting one because if you're thinking mobile only, or if you're thinking the latest version of web browsers, it's a good place to go because they basically parted ways with all the legacy code that had performance issues that supported things like IE8. So if you decide, hey, you know what, I'm only going to support the latest, kind of development kits and the web views, that's probably a good choice. Right? But it's a library, that's out there. You can certainly use it to augment what you're doing. All right. So moving on. So real quick about Phonegap, and again, I think most of you guys here probably have some idea about it already. So I'm not gonna. It's not really a kind of tutorial about Phonegap, but just a quick look at it. So here's a basic idea that you have a single code base, right? You use Phonegap, and then there's this build process. And Phonegap has also a cloud service now called Phonegap Build, which lets you compile and build, basically on the cloud for a small fee. It's still beta. Honestly, I haven't used this. I don't want to vouch for it either way. But in theory, it makes your job easier. But either way, whether you use their cloud or whether you use just a regular kind of build process, you can compile it into these multiple platforms. Right? There's plugins you can add in, including jQuery Mobile and Sencha Touch and things like that to help you build. Have more libraries they can add on, so you don't have to code as much. There's obviously IDs you can use. You can use text editors or whatever you're comfortable with, in terms of doing CSS and HTML5. So I think I've talked about most of these already. I think that the thing that I want to comment on here is, you still need to understand what it takes to compile code to native, right? Because the compilers, they're compilation helpers. They don't do all the work for you. You still need to understand, Xcode. You still need to be able to get into Eclipse for the Android WebKit. So it's not I wrote my HTML, I click on a button, and everything works. Typically, unless it's very trivial. Most apps are going to have some kind of configuration. There'll be some oddities. You throw it on Android, and it doesn't look right, or most likely you throw it, and performance sucks, and you have to go back and figure out what's going on. So, just be aware of that. And then it does require compilation per platform. So again, if you're doing 4 platforms, you have to compile 4 times. Therefore, your level of effort and bug fixing and stuff is 4x, not 1. Right? So that's important to know. Why Phonegap? I think there's a lot of good reasons. We already kind of talked about it. I think this stuff really is great. Here, the fact that you have access to native features of a phone device, or not just phone, of phone and tablet devices is good. It doesn't give you everything. The fact that you don't have to know all the ins and outs of coding to iOS or Android, that's good. There's definitely some shortcomings there. And then this whole build thing I mentioned to you, there's plugins and additional tools, and there's a fairly large community. All right, so I think we kind of most of that. And then it's free. That's really good, right? So you look at Accelerator, right, which is a product that was around before Phonegap really kind of got going, but you're paying, somewhere around $1,500 per developer for that. Not to mention you have to learn a whole new API. So the fact that it's free is good, and obviously all of us here do open source and like open source. Otherwise we shouldn't be here, right? So that's a good thing, right? So that's where if you look at the adoption numbers and you think a little bit longer term. Okay, even if Phonegap has issues now, even if HTML5 has issues now, the fact that there's a large amount of adoption, is free, and a large community, just like with Drupal, that's a good sign, right? If you're going to make an investment, it's better than on something that you're unsure if it's going to be around in a couple of years. All right, I think we talked about most of this. So, kind of a mobile Drupal website. Now a little bit more focus on Drupal here as opposed to just just mobile. So again, most of you guys are probably familiar with the themes that are already available with Drupal 7. And anybody here uses Omega, Zen, or other adaptive themes? Yeah. What's your experience with it for mobile? Any of you guys? You like it? And what are some of the big gotchas that you come across with these themes?
Menus. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So again, it's good that it's there though, because a lot of times you don't need more than this. So there's other kind of mobile frameworks as well you can put in there, including Phonegap. You can kind of use the kind of the cache manifest as an approach as well. It's a little bit tricky, and then obviously the one I think I'm looking forward to the most is where Drupal 8 goes, because it's really, from everything I've seen and heard, it's mobile to the core, right? So that's a really good thing. Obviously, it's at least a year out from practical usage, but nothing really happens overnight in this space. So the thing with this, and this is where why I'm kind of focusing on Phonegap and hybrid, is that all this really you got to be online, and your access to at least the hardcore native features are fairly limited, right? So there's a definite trade-off. I think the biggest one though is this, from my perspective, right? You got to be online. So not online, that's an issue, right? And these days more and more of us, are in all kinds of different, bandwidth situation on the plane, on a train or low bandwidth, whatever. So more and more you got to think, all right, what happens if the user is not online? What happens if you have to retain the state of that user or the interaction, things like that. So those are some of the reasons why you have to think, well, is a mobile theme really going to work for me? So just thinking implementation-wise, this is, I promise you I don't have too well. Actually, I have a few more kind of gnarly-looking pictures, but this one's probably the most important one. So in this context, right, this is Drupal right here, right? It doesn't have to be Drupal, right? You could have some other, you could have Alfresco here, you could have, whatever. But certainly this is Drupal for the solutions that we're talking about. And then you have your content authors and, editorial people, etc. Here, or your designers for adding the, AI files and the PNG files, etc. So that's what's happening there, right? And then here you have your dev team doing basically mobile coding, right? So whether they're using something like Phonegap, or they're doing native through Xcode or whatever, or just straight content, HTML content apps. And then all of this really, and including some content you may have live content on a web server, all of this at some point needs to be packaged, and that's the compilation process, right? And then once it's packaged, then you have to asynchronously push it out to the, to the app stores, right? To Google Play or the Apple App Store, and once it's there, then obviously then the device is available, and if from the device you're making access, you have access to content here, maybe there's some interaction there, or maybe it's cached in some kind of a cloud server or somewhere like that. But that's the basic process. So if you're thinking about this from a Drupal perspective, really this is what you're doing, right? These are the key things that at least we did, when we use Phonegap in this kind of context. So we configured certain modules, not all of them obviously, just the ones that were specific. You'd have to set up views just like you do with the mobile, mobile themes, responsive themes. And there's some specific services endpoints that you also have to set up. And it depends on exactly what you do with the API. But all of this is fairly well documented and fairly easy, again, relatively speaking. The stuff that we did for our kind of couple apps that we've built using Phonegap and Drupal, really we didn't stress Drupal, to be honest. It was more like the work had already been done here, we just leveraged it and just did this fairly quickly. There's also going back to kind of how else you can use Drupal and building mobile apps. There's a mobile app generator Mac. Anybody familiar with this? So this is a module and I guess initiative that's done by the community. It's really to assist you to create multi-platform mobile apps. It exports your website, kind of to to HTML, so that you don't have to code it all from, or you don't have to do a whole lot of coding to use it in Phonegap, and then it just basically expedites the process. We've used this. One of our developers kind of banged around with this for a week or two, and our assessment was that it's a decent starting point. If you're doing proof of concept, it's a good thing. Probably isn't much more than that unless you're just playing with it. There is the URL for it, and good place to go. It's another tool that I think you can use. There's several good examples there. And here's just a simple recipe if you like. You build a site, you add a mobile theme, you install Mac. So all of this is Drupal, obviously. You install this module, you select the menu, you export the content to the site, you copy it to Phonegap, and then where it says the mobile app is ready, that's only if it's really trivial, right? If you're doing, if you require some configuration or if compilation has some issues, then it's not that simple. But certainly, if you're doing some basic, kind of Sunday afternoon basement work, that's a good thing. You can go down and get that done. Yes.
Does this rule out having dynamic, database access if you're porting it all into HTML in your app?
Yeah. So dynamic database access, typically with any kind of mobile app, you do it in a kind of you do it through an application server. So you wouldn't do it directly. You use some protocols like SOAP or whatever. But it wouldn't. You'd have to most likely build the logic to to have the application server interact with a database and then serve you the information back. That's the way that we scale. Otherwise, it most likely wouldn't scale. You have a lot of reliability issues with the app. All right, so a little about Drupal 8. Again, I'm not an expert by any means in Drupal 8, so if I got it wrong, don't shoot me yet. So just some things that I've seen, I think we know about is obviously mobile friendly. I've seen Spark, which is a new authoring distribution. It looks really cool. It does. I love the way it does responsive, kind of adaptation to the size of your screen, right the way down to smartphone. So that's a really cool thing. I think that's going to be really useful for most of you guys getting to Drupal 8. It's got web services for native app integration, which is really useful. Because right now, these web services are things that you have to write yourself, or you're relying on people like Phonegap or FLDrupalCamp to do so. So if Drupal already provides us this, maybe using the responsive themes, right, and this, we don't have to use Phonegap. I haven't seen it, so I don't want to say yes or no. There's still probably a place for something like Phonegap, but that could make a huge difference because if you could write native code using Drupal API, and why would you want to add another set of tools? So we talked about this several times already. Full HTML5, mobile administration, which looks really good. I've seen that, and some front-end performance improvements, which obviously helps performance in general. And then that's where the documentation is. All right. Let's see. So real quick, I want to make sure I don't run over my time here. So this is the app that we built for. The WAL project it was built for web, iOS, and Android all at the same time using one source code base. I'm showing you the iOS here, but you can find it on both of those stores. It's primarily a content app. The only thing that's a little bit outside of content is there's some where is it? There's some social kind of the favorite. Has some social interactions and. You can do you can tweet it, and you can tie it to a blog, but it's primarily content, right? So, again, I think I already mentioned some of this. One other thing we did for this client was that the bulk of their information was sitting in Documentum and WordPress. So before we built this app, we essentially had a Drupal project to create the content in Drupal. Well, not create it. We basically built a connector to go from Documentum and WordPress to Drupal. So there was some additional work to be done, and this is a mobile-only strategy. There was no, equivalent website that we extracted from, or we're building to. So again, just some basic things. All this stuff really, I think, is just project management 101 for this kind of situation. So the thing that I think you got to really focus on is, you know, what is the content going to look like? Because it's not website content, right? You know, and the usability, what is it? Because this is the stuff that's materially different to regular projects. You know, and then the other thing for this client, and I think just about any client, is okay. You know, we put all this effort in, we spend a lot of money with you guys. How are we going to sustain it? Like what's the maintenance plan? What's the roadmap for maintaining content and functionality? It's really important because it's very easy to do it one time and then, like, you know, you're stuck, you know, with something that's just old content that's not updated. So that was a big part of what we did here. You know, and then obviously for this particular client, we had a very hard date to hit, which was the HIV International Conference in July last year in DC. So again, obvious things. You know, start with a wireframe. The thing with the wireframe here is very, very important. Again, lesson learned the hard way. Very important to figure out the colors and font size and things like this here, because if we don't, you know, and the client sees it, to go back and fix it is not, it's time consuming and it's painful. So get that right. Obviously, you know, do it quickly, low fidelity mock-ups as opposed to Illustrator or Photoshop. That's a waste of time, really, I think, at this level. You know, and then provide annotations. Real quick, technical design. Our focus, like I mentioned, was iOS and Android. You know, this whole idea of write once and deploy many. We use the Essential Touch framework for several specific modules. Integrated Drupal with WordPress for content. This is roughly what this looked like. Drupal on one end, WordPress here, and then the API that we built ourselves. And then Essential Touch toolkit, and then within the Phonegap framework, and obviously all of that within the operating system. So kind of a quick look at, again, I mentioned this briefly before, but these are the specific things that we did with Drupal for this particular client. You know, we had a custom content module to model the articles that they had. And then we had kind of a view and data source modules that generated JSON that Phonegap needed and tied into our API. We use a number of Drupal modules, or plugins, and these are the lists. Some of them we could have done without maybe, but you know, the views one was used a lot, the data source was used a lot, Google Analytics, some backend reporting. And again, this is kind of what it looked like. That's a pictorial, right? We have, here's Drupal, we got our templates and security and such. And this is the stage where we kind of made our customizations in blue, and the JSON modules and search and such. And then, you know, down here with the article content type that was added. And yeah, that was it. Fairly simple, really not. It was a fairly painless exercise from Drupal perspective. This is a more detailed kind of architecture picture to kind of show you some of the additional pieces of the solution. You know, again, you can see we have the Phonegap. Here's the Essential toolkit there, and then this is our specific custom modules that we developed. These two libraries, and then this is the specific APIs that we built. You know, those 5 or 6 web services. You know, and then that interacts with the API engine that Phonegap provides. You know, which interacts with the you know, kind of the native APIs that again Phonegap provides. Right, here's the API calls, and then you know, this is basically really all we did was Apple and Android. Where's Android? Yeah. There. And again, you can see that the ones that we use are primarily for content, so touch, you know, keyboard, you know, Wi-Fi, accelerometer, compass, you know, and storage, because we have a fair amount of cache content for offline usage. Again, one of the key things with this particular client was that the users are going to be in very low bandwidth, difficult to reach, you know, internet access, situations where they really need to be able to get the content once, and then be able to use it other times without internet access. So that was part of our thinking. All right. Physical architecture, you know, is fairly simple. You know, we had the legacy content systems. This is the Drupal repository that was in the mix. This is our web servers, and then we had the caching. This is outside of our media. This is the caching engine that we use, and then going to users. This is a kind of a more blown up version of it. We have not deployed this yet. This is just a design, mainly because you know, the client this would have cost like another couple $100,000 to do. So the client isn't at that stage yet, but this is the design that we had set up to scale performance, right? For people, I guess LinkedIn and PayPal and Facebook, people like that. Obviously, this is a reality. They have to do this to get any kind of decent performance. From our perspective, it was more of a design approach. So again, this is just a summary. I think I've already kind of mentioned most of this. This is what we did to extend Phonegap and Drupal specifically. So we accelerated development using Sencha. I think I've already mentioned these other things. We used caching to improve the API performance, and then the plugins that we use. All right, so I think this is the most interesting part of kind of the session. Hopefully you'll find it interesting, which is really some lessons learned, do's and don'ts, and kind of best practices maybe. So some of this are just mobile only, and some are specific to Phonegap and Drupal. So I think most of this is self-explanatory at this stage. Everybody's done this. Key thing here is this: you got to design for touch. You got to think, all right, what is my target tab area, right? It's not a mouse click. Don't write mouse overs and mouse events, right? You do that, performance is going to suck. You need to build touch events in your HTML, in your JavaScript. So that's really important. Maximize the real estate. Obviously, if you're building something that is going to be used on the iPad, you really want to maximize it. Users are not going to like doing the old universal app where you click on the 1x, 2x. That stuff just doesn't work. So developing agile, I think this kind of thing requires a lot of feedback from the client. There's a lot of things that don't quite work right. Anything other than agile, you're going to have probably a very long project and a pretty unhappy client. But doing it agile is not that easy. So pick your poison. Again, we talk about screen resolution and think bandwidth. That's a big part of it, particularly if you're dealing with offline content situations. So don't I think we talked about this. I think it's self-explanatory. Don't design as a website. The fixed layout thing. This is it's an interesting thing. So obviously, as you know, with responsive themes, you don't want to have fixed width and height and things like that, because then it doesn't flow as you change your device. The one caveat here is when you're dealing specifically with HTML content reflow, because performance, particularly with Phonegap, performance is an issue with content reflow, and if you don't know what you're doing. And in some cases, and for some specific elements of HTML, it is useful to have a fixed width and fixed height. So that's the one caveat. In general, for mobile, no. But if you have performance issues, tweak a couple of the HTMLs by putting fixed height and fixed width, particularly for things that you have a pretty good idea of what it's going to look like across different devices, right? So again, obviously, don't design apps that require a manual, things like that. That makes it. They don't kind of. Yes, we've seen this occasionally where developers get over ambitious or over enthusiastic. They design their own gestures that then conflict with iOS's gestures. Yeah, don't do stuff like that, right? I mean, don't do the 5-hand pinch if it's going to be used on an iPad, because then your app's going to blow up. Just stuff like that. So responsive design, I think you guys, there's a bunch of people here I think who are already fairly educated about this. Just give some comments. Obviously, image and management optimization is really important to be responsive to performance. Resource management, particularly from a JavaScript perspective, is really important. Content reflow, I think I talked about quite a bit. UI elements, again, how they're going to flow, and then also kind of tables of data, right? Particularly, this is actually a very important one, because there's a lot of times where your data doesn't flow correctly, and you lose the logic, because all of a sudden, 3 columns that are critical to your information are missing, or they're they wrap around. That's a really important one to kind of keep in mind, and make sure you test it on the device. Let's see. For web content, again, most of this is this is obviously web content on the mobile device, not on the browser. So make sure the font size is big enough, and appropriate kind of resizing tools. One of the big kind of complaints we hear from some of our clients about asks that they have is that the users can't increase or decrease the font size. or you know, or it's like just think through stuff like that. Just simple little things like, you know, you might have seen with ours. You could do a small A to big A. Stuff like that makes a usability difference. So, you know, increase the kind of the padding for page elements to improve the touch accuracy. I mean, if you have a, you know, padding that's 1 pixel, you know, you're trying to kind of like get it. I mean, it just doesn't work. Just think touch, right? You got a big ass finger. You know, how is that really going to work, right? So, which all of this goes back to testing too, which I'll talk about in a minute. Again, we talked about this. You don't have mouse overs. Obviously, flash content is not going to work. You know, if you have, I was talking to a client just yesterday, and they're like, you know, we have 2,000 hours of training content that we'd like to put on mobile. And my first question is, what's the format of the training content? And they're like, Flash. I'm like, good luck. So I mean, you really can't do much with that, right? So I think we talked about this. I got a couple minutes up. Kind of this idea of fluid content flow. So it adapts to different sizes. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. So improving content performance is actually a really important area, I think, probably for all of us, whether it's responsive or whether it's Phonegap, and I'm going to comment on both. So I think we'll talk about this quite a bit, so I'm not going to go over it again. The key thing here is don't like have, you know, 7 layers of nesting for your HTML elements, right? When the processing engine is going to go through that, having to go through all of that and compute results and bring it back, that most of the time leads to a lot of performance issues. And these are the kind of things that are going to be hard for you to find. You know, the compiler doesn't show that as an error. It's just something that you realize doesn't work very well. So reduce HTTP requests. You know, don't, you know, have a page in a mobile app that has 7 HTTP requests, right? It can't be that chatty for 2 reasons. 1, performance is going to be slow. 2, you're going to drain the battery. And pretty soon the users are going to be very unhappy, right? Because they're going to look at the battery meter and like, oh, this R media app. Why the heck every time I'm running it, it's you know, killing my battery? It's probably because you're doing way too many HTTP requests, right? You don't want to do that. You don't want to kill that. You don't want to rev up the antenna every time you do, you know, you load a page. Again, this is self-explanatory, obviously. You can stay away from things like, you know, CSS shadows and gradients, things like that. You know, keep the graphics simple, because that stuff is processed by the mobile phone. So it's going to lead to perception of slowness. So you want to stay away from that. Again, I think this is self-explanatory. You kind of use JavaScript and CSS, optimize the use of these, and concatenate them, pre-compile the images. In particular, for this the web project app that we built, you know, the first couple of development builds that we had, performance was horrendous. You're like, what on earth is going on here? You know, it turned out that, you know, we had to pre-compile our code, our HTML, right? That was the key thing. Once we pre-compiled that and concatenated JavaScript, it just made it that much faster. I mean, it made it, you know, zip along. Use CSS as opposed to JavaScript to do, you know, kind of transitions. It's much faster. JavaScript, you know, takes a bigger burden. There's a bigger payload for JavaScript than CSS. And then again, obviously use touch events, don't use mouse events when you're building these kind of things. And then for 3D transformations, try to, in your HTML, you can basically make a call to the accelerometer on your phone. The only caveat here is that it's not a silver bullet. This doesn't work for every HTML element. There's a couple of HTML elements you're going to do this and it's going to blow up your performance. So just watch out for it. Most of the time, this is decent advice, but not every time. So again, you have to test it. So testing your app. So I'm kind of circling back to Phonegap now and bringing it back to topic. So the emulator, you know, has a lot of limitations. You know, use that really obviously as very elementary testing, right? Don't rely on it by any means. You must, for any kind of mobile device, or any mobile app, including just content-based mobile apps, you've got to test on the device. You know, you absolutely must. You know, for just as an example, for the Well project, we tested it on iOS 4, iOS 5, and iPhone 4, iPhone 4S, iPhone 5, And then on Android, we tested it for Android 2.1, 2.2, 4.1, 4.2, and then multiple devices within that. So I mean, and then iPad as well. So our testing matrix was like 15 or 16 devices, and it wasn't really that extensive. So you really got to kind of think that through. Is how are you going to really test this stuff? Again, I just talked about that. So do a kind of, this is something that everybody kind of comes across. Make sure you have a detailed pre-check list. Most of the time you do something and Apple comes back 2 weeks later saying, hey, you missed something. So really go through that, particularly with them. Google is actually much easier. You just get it out in a day, and if it blows up, you find out the hard way. But Apple is much more rigorous, and they'll come back to you, and it's kind of annoying. So again, test not just the installation process, but also what happens if you have to upgrade. Kind of the application load, stuff like that. Not just the basic, kind of the first step of it. Again, test for things like what happens if there's a Skype call in the middle of your application. Can you gracefully deal with it, or does it blow up? Right? This is with graceful, but what I call graceful exits are something that is most often forgotten. People don't really think, well, what happens to that? Particularly if you have an app where you're retaining state, or you have some content that needs to be stored offline. What happens if there's a message coming in or whatever. So moving on. So a couple of lessons learned the hard way real quick. Okay, probably the most important one is this. If you're doing Phonegap, your goal should not be to build a native app that looks like native app, has the same experience. Because if that's your goal, you're going to fail. Seriously. You got to know where to compromise. And you got to tell your clients or yourselves or your team, hey, you know what, that's the cutoff line. And any more than that, I'm just not going to do because it's not going to work. Learn Xcode, I think that's important. Just Xcode, Eclipse, and the Android toolkit. I think we talked about this. Use animation to show the perception of performance. A low animation kind of makes the app looks like it's a little bit faster than it is. Use where you can use swipe as opposed to tap. It's just a better gesture. It's a little bit more user interactive. It gives you a little more original flavor. Again, we talked about the fact that the figure is not accurate, make it big enough. Manage your content with discipline. Make sure you have the usual editorial, workflow, things like that. And don't forget metadata, right? Just because it's a mobile app, you still need to have metadata to be able to find things, retrieve things, be able to manipulate the content. Other things learned the hard way real quick, obvious things. Test, retest, don't leave it to developers. All developers will tell you works perfectly. I've been there. You need to have a QA team. Trust me, if you don't have a QA team when you're doing mobile, it's going to fail. Your client's going to come in and we'll have to hatchet at your neck. So really plan for how you're going to demo it, particularly if your team is remote, if your client's remote. Because it's not that easy to remotely demo something that's not live. You got to think that, for instance, all your clients need to send you their UDIDs if you're on iOS. Right, so you're going to have to call them, hey, Mr. Client, go here, click on this, right-click on that, find the UDID, send it to me, and it's a pain in the ass. So buffer extra time for Apple approval is always the case. I don't think it's going to change. So I talked about compilation quite a few times. Phonegap is really powerful. It's not flawless though. Make sure to sign up for support if you're doing anything serious. We wasted like a week of developer time doing our own crap, and then we, paid the $100, submitted a ticket, and turned out we found out the answer after about half a day. It's dumb stuff you don't want to do. So that's really it. That's kind of all I have for you. This is real quick about our media, but here's my contact information. Questions?
Will you put this up online on your?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I have a book to give away. So we need to have at least one more quick question, one or two. I have some other questions. Yes.
How long did it take you to get a Phonegap dev environment set up?
It took not that long, probably about 2 weeks or so.
Okay.
But we found out it wasn't done correctly. We had to almost in QA rebuild it, particularly deployment. Yes.
This isn't so much as a question or just a general statement. Earlier last year, you were talking about refining, how you still need to know about the IDEs like Eclipse and Xcode and stuff, to deploy Phonegap. Well, Phonegap released this app called, it's on build.phonegap.com, that you can just upload, sort of like a
Yep.
Where so long as your project is open source, you want to pay for private repositories. You can upload your HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and they will deploy or compile your code for you to all.
Exactly. And you're right about that, and I commented on it a little bit earlier. This is their kind of cloud build, which I think is still in beta, actually. But it is an option. The only thing is, though, if you're doing anything more than that's something that's kind of, I don't want to say trivial, but if it's more complicated, it's probably unrealistic. Like in our situation, when we have Documentum and Drupal and WordPress as our sources for content, there's no way that would work. Yes?
This kind of goes along with the subject of that book. I mean, is there any, you mentioned testing a lot, and I understand you've got to test it on the different devices in your matrix. Is there any sort of automated testing that you either mentioned that I missed, or that, that would kind of go along with other automated tests in other development environments?
Yeah, the good news is yes, there is. There's several of them. We use one, and honestly, I forget what the website was. There's several out there. I haven't used one lately that I can recommend, but I know there's several out there that help you. End of the day, though, is that there are certain things you just can't easily automate, or that you really need to have a human, kind of oversight, because it's really more about the usability side of it as opposed to the functionality. So honestly, I don't think you can get away without the QA function, but you can certainly expedite it. Yes?
Does Phonegap play nice with the voiceover and accessibility options on iOS devices? Like, can it read the text in there, and can you navigate using that?
That's a good question. Honestly, I don't know.
Okay.
So I'll take that offline. I don't know. We did not use that.
Okay.
But that is a good question.
Let me ask you something. One of the problems this hybrid tabs have is the issue with security, being able to reverse engineer and see the code in the world.
Yes.
How do you handle that? Do you do any
Well, again, it's one of those things I mentioned to you that you kind of have to take. There are certain compromises you make. So if security is something that's very important to, particularly that kind of esoteric security issue, then you probably want to look for a different option, or maybe you want to look at something like Corona or what's it called, like accelerometer or Marmaduke, whatever. There's some other ways of doing it where you don't have this. It's much more difficult to get to the code. You can obfuscate it. Right now, though, I don't think there is a really easy way around it. But in most cases, it's probably not. It may not be that big a deal if your content is fairly trivial. You're not doing anything that's, in any way kind of secure. Hopefully that answers your question. Any other questions? All right. Is it lunchtime next?
Yeah.
All right, cool. That's why nobody's there. All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate your time.